I've reviewed the structure and narrative style of the example. The writing's deliberate pacing, sensory detail, and subtle buildup of tension are key elements. I'll now craft the first portion of your requested story, ensuring it mirrors the evocative and emotionally rich style of the example. The garage was dimly lit, a single bulb casting a weak yellow glow over the cluttered space. The scent of motor oil and sawdust lingered in the air, mixing with the faint tang of summer sweat as I wiped my hands on a rag. I'd been out there for hours, tinkering with an old carburetor, trying to distract myself from the gnawing frustration of the week. The sound of the door creaking open caught me off guard, and I glanced up to see Kyle standing in the frame, silhouetted against the sunlight spilling in from outside. He grinned as he stepped in, his sneakers crunching lightly on the concrete floor. "Figured I'd find you in here," he said, his voice warm, familiar, and somehow sharper than the tools strewn across the workbench. Kyle was my best friend, the kind of friend who knew when to show up without asking, who could tell when I needed a laugh, a distraction, or just someone to share the silence with. He was a little taller than me, lean but strong, with an easy confidence that always seemed just out of reach for me. The sunlight caught on his messy hair, and I felt a pang in my chest I refused to name. "Needed to clear my head," I said, forcing a casual tone. I went back to fiddling with the carburetor, though my fingers were clumsier now. "What's up?" He shrugged, leaning against the workbench. The closeness made the small space feel even smaller, the air thicker somehow. "You've been quiet all week. Thought I'd check in." I nodded, not trusting myself to look at him just yet. Kyle had a way of seeing too much with one glance, peeling back the layers I tried to keep hidden. "Work stuff," I muttered, though that was only half true. The real answer felt too tangled, too close to something I wasn't ready to admit. Not to him, not to myself. Kyle reached out, his fingers brushing a wrench that lay between us. "Same old, huh?" His tone was light, but there was a thread of concern woven through it. "You sure that's all it is?" I could feel his eyes on me, could feel the weight of his presence, the quiet patience that never rushed me but always pressed. Just enough. My chest tightened as I forced a smile, finally glancing up at him. "Yeah, just needed to get my hands dirty," I said, gesturing to the carburetor. "It helps me think." He tilted his head, his grin softening into something more serious. "You're a terrible liar, you know that?" I laughed, but it came out rougher than I intended. "Maybe." Kyle stepped closer, the scent of his cologne, woodsy, clean, blending with the heady mix of the garage. He leaned on the workbench again, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Well," he said, his voice quieter now, almost teasing. "If you're not going to talk, maybe I'll just hang out until you do." The words were simple, but they settled between us like a challenge. I wanted to tell him to leave, to give me space to breathe, but instead I found myself shifting closer, drawn to the comfort of his presence even as it made my pulse race. "Suit yourself," I said, though the words felt hollow. I was too aware of the way his arm brushed against mine, the way his knee bumped against the workbench. He picked up a screwdriver, turning it idly in his hand as he watched me. His gaze was steady, intense, and I felt heat rise to my face under the weight of it. I forced myself to focus on the carburetor, but my hands were trembling now, my movements fumbling. "Here," Kyle said, setting the screwdriver down. He reached for the carburetor, his hand brushing mine as he turned it slightly. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me that I hoped he didn't notice. "You're overthinking it," he said, his voice low, steady. "Just relax." I swallowed hard, the words catching in my throat as he adjusted the carburetor, his fingers sure and confident. I should have been grateful for the help, but all I could think about was the closeness, the way his shoulder pressed against mine as he leaned in. "You've always been good at this," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. The words felt heavy, loaded with something I couldn't name. Kyle glanced at me, his smile faint but warm. comes with practice. You could be just as good if you let yourself relax. The double meaning in his words wasn't lost on me, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. Instead, I stayed silent, my chest tight as I watched him work. His hands moved with practiced ease, the veins in his forearms standing out as he tightened a bolt. I forced my gaze away, but it was no use. My thoughts were spiraling, the air between us growing heavier with every second. Finally, Kyle set the carburetor down, turning to face me fully. His expression had softened, the teasing edge replaced by something quieter, more serious. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "You okay?" The question was simple, but it broke something open inside me. I nodded, though the lump in my throat made it hard to speak. Kyle's hand brushed my arm, his touch light but grounding. "You know you can talk to me, right? About anything." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and the intensity in his gaze made my breath catch. There was something unspoken there, something that made my chest ache with equal parts fear and longing. "I know," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "It's just complicated." He nodded, his fingers lingering on my arm. "It doesn't have to be." The words hung between us, a challenge, an invitation. And for the first time I felt the walls I'd built around myself start to crack. The silence between us stretched out, thick and charged. Kyle's hand was still on my arm, his touch warm, steady, grounding me in a moment that felt both surreal and inescapably real. My breath hitched and I forced myself to meet his gaze again, the intensity there making my chest feel impossibly tight. "What if it's not that simple?" I said, my voice barely audible. I wasn't even sure what I meant, but I needed to say something, anything, to fill the weight of the quiet that hung between us. Kyle's fingers tightened just slightly, a reassuring pressure. "Then we figure it out," he said softly, his tone so calm, so certain, it left no room for doubt. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out. Together." Something inside me twisted at his words, at the way he said them like they were a promise, an unshakable truth. I wanted to believe him, but the thought of letting myself hope, of crossing a line I wasn't sure either of us could come back from, made my pulse race with equal parts fear and longing. "You don't get it," I said, shaking my head. I pulled my arm away more abruptly than I meant to, and instantly regretted it when I saw the flicker of hurt cross his face. "It's not just... I can't just..." Kyle straightened, his hand falling back to his side, but he didn't step away. If anything, he seemed closer now, his presence all-encompassing in the small space. "Can't what?" he asked, his voice still soft but edged with something I couldn't place. "Talk to me? Be honest with me?" I let out a shaky breath, running a hand through my hair as I turned away, pretending to fiddle with the tools on the workbench. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to have the perfect words," Kyle said, his voice steady. "Just start somewhere." I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the workbench as if it could anchor me, keep me from spiraling. The words were there, just beneath the surface, but saying them felt like stepping off a ledge I couldn't see the bottom of. "Why are you doing this?" I asked finally, my voice rough. I turned back to him, my chest heaving with the weight of everything I wasn't saying. "Why now?" Kyle's expression softened, and for a moment he didn't answer. He just looked at me, his gaze searching mine as if trying to find the right response. "Because I care about you," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "And because I've been waiting for you to see it." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from my lungs. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest as the reality of what he was saying settled over me. He wasn't just talking about friendship, that much was clear. This was something deeper, something I'd felt in the quiet moments between us but never dared to acknowledge. "I don't know if I can do this," I said, my voice breaking. "What if it ruins everything?" Kyle stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate, as if giving me every opportunity to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the spot, my body frozen as he closed the space between us. "Do you really think it could ruin everything?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Or are you just scared it might change things?" His words cut through me, stripping away the layers I'd spent years building around myself. I wanted to argue, to push him away, but I couldn't, because he was right. I was scared, not just of the change, but of the intensity of what I felt when I looked at him, when I let myself imagine what it might mean to let go. Kyle's hand came up, brushing lightly against my cheek. His touch was gentle, hesitant, as if giving me the choice to lean into it or pull away. I didn't move, my breath catching as I felt the warmth of his palm against my skin. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice so soft it sent a shiver down my spine. "If you don't want this, just tell me, and I will. But if you do—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the unspoken words hung heavy in the air between us. I looked at him, at the vulnerability in his expression, and something inside me cracked wide open. I didn't know what I wanted, didn't know how to put it into words, but I knew I couldn't tell him to stop. Not when every fiber of my being was screaming for me to take this leap, to see where it might lead. Instead of answering, I closed the remaining distance between us, my hands gripping the front of his shirt as I pulled him into me. Our lips met, tentative at first, a question more than a declaration. But the moment his mouth moved against mine, the hesitation melted away. Kyle's hands cupped my face, his touch steady, grounding as the kiss deepened. It was everything and nothing like I'd imagined, soft and urgent all at once, a rush of emotions I couldn't even begin to untangle. I let myself get lost in it, in the warmth of his body pressed against mine, the way his fingers traced the line of my jaw like he'd been waiting for this moment just as long as I had. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathless, Kyle rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed as he let out a shaky laugh. "You have no idea how long I've wanted to do that." I smiled, the tension in my chest easing for the first time in what felt like forever. "I think I might." He laughed again, his thumb brushing lightly against my cheek. "You okay?" I nodded, my heart still racing but my breathing starting to steady. "Yeah, I think I am." Kyle's smile softened, his gaze holding mine with a quiet intensity. "Good, because I'm not going anywhere." I let out a shaky breath, the weight of his words settling over me. There was still so much to figure out, so many questions I didn't have answers to, but in that moment, with Kyle's hand still cradling my face and the warmth of his breath on my skin, I knew one thing for certain. I didn't want to go anywhere either. The air between us felt heavier now, as if every unsaid word, every fleeting glance had built to this point. Kyle's hands lingered on my face, his thumbs brushing over my cheeks with a tenderness that made my chest ache. I couldn't look away from him, couldn't pretend that this moment wasn't changing everything. "Still with me?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. "Yeah," I said, though my voice came out rough, unsteady. "I'm here." Kyle smiled, faint and almost shy, a rarity for him. He pulled back just enough to let his hands fall from my face, though the absence of his touch left me feeling strangely untethered. He stayed close, his gaze never leaving mine as he leaned against the workbench. I could see the rise and fall of his chest, the slight tremor in his fingers as he adjusted his stance. It wasn't just me who was nervous. "So," he said after a moment, the word heavy with everything unsaid, "where do we go from here?" I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, my hands still gripping the edge of the workbench to keep myself grounded. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think I want to find out." Kyle's smile widened just slightly, a warmth spreading through his expression that made my heart skip a beat. "Yeah?" "Yeah," I said, my voice firmer this time, "but I need time to figure it out, to figure me out." Kyle nodded, his understanding evident in the way his posture softened, his hands sliding into his pockets. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." The simplicity of his words, the quiet conviction in them, unraveled something inside me. For so long I'd buried how I felt, pushed it down beneath layers of denial and fear. But Kyle had a way of cutting through all of that, of seeing me for who I was even when I couldn't. "Why are you so patient with me?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. He tilted his head, studying me with an intensity that made my stomach flip. "Because you're worth it," he said simply, "and because I know what it's like to be scared of wanting something that feels too big." His words hung in the air, resonating deep in my chest. I wanted to respond, to tell him how much it meant to hear that, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I stepped closer, my hand brushing against his where it rested on the workbench. Kyle's gaze flicked to our hands, his fingers twitching as if resisting the urge to reach for mine. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice quieter now. I nodded, my throat tight. "I'm not sure about a lot of things," I said honestly, "but I'm sure about you." His eyes softened, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us crackled with a quiet intensity, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on us. Then, slowly, Kyle's hand turned, his fingers brushing against mine before curling around them. The warmth of his touch sent a jolt through me, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. He gave my hand a gentle squeeze, his thumb tracing over my knuckles in a soothing rhythm. "Baby steps," he said, his tone light but with an undercurrent of sincerity that made my chest ache. I smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that felt like a small victory. "Baby steps." Kyle laughed softly, the sound easing the tension that had been building in my chest. He pulled me into a loose hug, his arms wrapping around my shoulders in a way that felt both protective and freeing. I let myself relax into him, my forehead resting against his shoulder as I breathed him in, the faint scent of cologne and motor oil, the warmth of his body against mine. We stood like that for what felt like hours, the world outside the garage fading into the background. I didn't know what the future would look like, didn't have all the answers I thought I needed. But in that moment, with Kyle's arms around me and the quiet assurance of his presence, I felt like I'd finally found solid ground, and, for now, that was enough. The stillness in the garage settled around us, comforting in its simplicity. Kyle hadn't moved, his arms loose but steady around me, and I felt myself letting go of the tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. The silence between us wasn't heavy now. It was calm, filled with the quiet understanding that whatever came next, we'd face it together. Kyle shifted slightly, his chin brushing the top of my head. "I guess I should probably let you finish working," he said, though there was no urgency in his tone. I let out a soft laugh, the sound surprising even to me. Pretty sure I wasn't getting much done anyway. His arms tightened briefly, a reassuring squeeze, before he pulled back just enough to look at me. His face was so close I could see the faint freckles dusted across his nose, the slight curve of a smirk pulling at his lips. "That's fair," he said, his voice low, teasing, "but don't use me as an excuse when your bike's still in pieces next week." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't stop the smile that tugged at my mouth. "I'll figure it out. Eventually." "Good," Kyle said, his gaze softening. His hand came up, brushing lightly against my jaw in a way that made my breath catch. "Because you're good at figuring things out, even when you don't think you are." The quiet confidence in his words struck something deep inside me, a warmth blooming in my chest that I didn't know how to put into words. I wanted to tell him how much it meant, how much he meant, but the words felt too big, too fragile to say aloud just yet. Instead, I leaned into his touch, letting my eyes close as I took in the moment. His thumb brushed along my cheek, a gentle, grounding motion, and I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could let myself have this. Whatever it was, whatever it might become. When I opened my eyes, Kyle was watching me, his expression unreadable but open in a way that made my heart stutter. "You're thinking too much again," he said softly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. Kyle's smile widened just slightly, a spark of mischief in his eyes now. "Want me to fix that?" Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft, unhurried, but no less intense for its tenderness. I melted into it, my hands finding their way to his shirt, holding on to him as if letting go would send me spiraling. When he pulled back, his forehead resting against mine, his breath warm against my skin, I felt lighter somehow, like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. "You okay?" Kyle asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, a small shaky laugh escaping me. "Yeah, more than okay." His smile was brighter now, and he pressed a quick kiss to my forehead before pulling me into another hug. "Good," he said, his voice steady, "because I'm not going anywhere." The quiet conviction in his words settled something deep inside me, and I felt my own arms tighten around him in response. We stayed like that for a while, the hum of the garage and the faint chirp of cicadas outside the only sounds breaking the stillness. When we finally pulled apart, Kyle's hand lingered on my arm, his touch warm and grounding. "Guess I should let you get back to work," he said, though there was a teasing edge to his tone that made me laugh. "Yeah, right," I said, rolling my eyes, "like you're really going to let me concentrate now." Kyle grinned, his confidence returning in full force. "Maybe not, but I'll bring pizza later to make up for it." "Deal," I said, the word coming out softer than I intended. I watched as he stepped toward the door, his movements easy, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. He paused in the doorway, turning back to look at me, his grin softening into something quieter. "Hey," he said, his voice low but steady. "Don't overthink this, okay? Just let it be." I nodded, the lump in my throat making it hard to speak. "I'll try." He smiled, the kind of smile that felt like a promise before slipping out of the garage and into the fading sunlight. I stood there for a long time after he left, the faint scent of his cologne still lingering in the air, the warmth of his touch still ghosting across my skin. My mind raced with questions, with fears, but beneath it all was something new, a flicker of hope, of possibility. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I didn't have to have all the answers. I could take it one step at a time, let it unfold naturally. And with Kyle by my side, maybe that was enough. For now, it was more than enough.